Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest is Dr. R.Wald. She's a president of Transversal Consulting. She's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center and a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. She has also authored her book, Saudi Incorporated, on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Welcome, Dr. Wald.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Wald, we are currently observing a very tense situation on the ground around the Saudi Arabia in the region. We have seen escalation with Iranian strikes against the targets in Iraq and Syria, endangering the US citizens. The US and the UK have confirmed strikes against the Houthi rebels. And the Houthi rebels effectively established a naval blockade blocking sea routes, important sea routes in the Red Sea. What is going on in the region? Is it a normal situation or is it a new global conflict?
I would say this is definitely a very significant heightening of tensions that we have seen developing for a long time. And obviously there's kind of a long history to the Houthis and their issues in Yemen, their association with Iran, their relationship with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But what we're seeing right now in terms of what's going on in the Red Sea in particular is a pretty, I think, severe escalation of a lot of these tensions. And then when you combine that with what Iran seems to be doing right now, which is we're seeing, strikes at some sort of targets in northern Iraq in the Kurdistan region. And just recently there was it seemed to be an Iranian airstrike in Pakistan, and so there's definitely a heightening of tensions. I wouldn't say we're like quite at the level of when the U.S. assassinated Qasem Soleimani in early 2020. I mean, we haven't seen like commercial flights being rerouted, for example, which was something that we saw then. But what's going on with shipping is, I would say, a very, very significant issue and risk today. In terms of for oil, but not just for oil, for all sorts of commerce and also for the diplomatic and military issues.
We have seen that what is going on in the region, especially the trade routes, the blockade of the trade routes, has an extremely negative impact on the economy of Saudi Arabia. And still they don't want to participate in the US and UK strikes because of political reasons, obviously. What play do they play?
So it's very complicated in terms of Saudi Arabia's potential involvement in something like this. And it goes back really to basically Saudi Arabia and UAE attempted to basically like overthrow the Houthi government. And they got themselves like embroiled in this ground war in Yemen that they were not winning. And the Houthis were actually, they sent missiles to Riyadh. I mean, there were some that fell very close to the Riyadh airport. It got to the point where they had to get they got technology from the U.S. to combat these missiles in the air, kind of similar to the Iron Dome technology that Israel uses. The UAE also faced some strikes from Houthis, and so finally in 2021, this was like a losing prospect for Saudi Arabia, which is surprising given Saudi Arabia is such a big state and Yemen should be such a small state. Having all of this, humanitarian disasters in Yemen. I mean, it's not a very prosperous state we're talking about, but the Saudi and UAE forces were just failing miserably. It was like a quagmire, essentially. And so China eventually kind of negotiated this, like, I don't want to call it it's certainly not a peace, more I would say like a truce in a sense where everyone could just kind of, not a kind of final agreement, but a state of being in which they kind of all agreed to like stop fighting. And so Saudi Arabia is really loath to disturb that. First of all, because the Houthis were attacking, their port city, and refineries on so most of Saudi Arabia's oil industry is actually on its east coast, in the all off the Persian Gulf, but it does have important and growing in importance facilities on the Red Sea. So there's a big refinery in Yanbu and Jizal. There are important ports and refineries there, and they were under attack from Yemen, and so they have this kind of very carefully agreed upon truce, and the Saudis do not want to disturb that. So I think that's probably the main reason you can see the Saudis do not want to get involved in this as, say, active participants. And the truth is that, like, the US and the UK don't really need the Saudi military to be involved in any way. But what's interesting is that so we saw this coalition finally get formed to deal with what was essentially like piracy in the Red Sea. Like, think about like old style pirate, like the Barbary pirates. Okay, we're talking piracy. They're commandeering vessels, and they're shooting at other ships. So finally we get this international coalition that gets formed, and then they do nothing. They're sitting, and kind of everyone's like, well, what's going on? Like, are you going to take care of this or not? And then Secretary Secretary Blinken goes to Saudi Arabia, and he meets with Mohammed bin Salman in Al Ula, which is this like historic city. And like the next day after he leaves, we get airstrikes. So to me, that says to me that Saudi Arabia basically gave its tacit approval for this. That there was something that went on there that, even if the Saudis couldn't officially be on board as part of the coalition, they're okay with this. And that had to happen before we could get these airstrikes. Then, afterwards they issued this statement. Obviously, they're not thrilled about having, airstrikes, near their territory, but essentially the statement was in support of what the coalition is doing, and the same with the UAE. So while they're trying to be very careful not to say that they support the U.S. in its position in, say, Gaza and vis-a-vis Israel, they don't support what the Houthis are doing. It's bad for their business. It's bad for that, but they don't want to get involved in another military conflict. So I think that's kind of the complicated line that they're walking here. And the real question, I think, is how far do the U.S. have to go militarily in order to actually eliminate the Houthi threat? And to what extent are they going to find that means that they have to deal with Iran? And that's a much more, I think, complicated question.
That is an extremely important question, and that is what I wanted to ask you as my next one. But before I do this, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel, to like this video, to share it, and if you have your ideas, then leave your comments under this video. We are talking to Dr. R.Wald, who is an expert in Saudi Arabia and in energy questions. She has authored a book, Saudi Incorporated, on the internal issues of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And today is the best time to speak to her because all the events in the regions are around the Saudi Arabia. Dr. R.Wald, you have described this conflict between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Houthis back to 2021. And he said that for the Saudi army, the war did not went that well, despite the fact that we could imagine that such a rich country with a lot of military equipment could have demonstrated the full dominance in the area. But was it the defeat or de facto defeat against by the Houthis or by the Iran?
So that's a really good question. And I think that for a long time, so the Houthis kind of appeared on the scene in like 2004. So they're not, new group, like a suddenly new group. It's not like ISIS. They've been around for a while. And it seemed initially that they really were not any kind of Iranian subsidiary. But the Yemen government made a concerted effort to portray them as basically the same as Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is actually, Hassan Nasrallah came from Iran to Lebanon to set up Hezbollah, like he was Iranian. So that was pretty clear, the connections between Hezbollah and Iran. The connections between the Houthis kind of came a lot later, but there was a concerted effort both by the government in Yemen and also by the Saudis and the Emiratis to really portray the Houthis as basically like an Iranian group. And this wasn't exactly true. They tried a lot to portray it as like a sectarian conflict, that these are, Shias. Are the Houthis actually Shias? It's a little more complicated. They come from this group that are actually this kind of sect. Yes, I would say it's a Shia branch. It's called Zaidi, and they actually broke up. So the difference between Sunni and Shia is in the number of imams they follow after Muhammad and after Ali, who died. He took over a little bit after Muhammad. I don't want to go through the whole thing. This is not a history course, though I think it is quite interesting. But essentially, the Zaydis broke off after a disagreement over who the fifth imam was, and the Imamis, which is like the mainstream Shiism, go down to 12. And there's another group that broke off at 7 called Ismailis. But anyway, so they're not entirely like, I would say like the difference is kind of like the difference between Coptic Christians and Catholics. So yeah, they're like in the same general region, but they're not totally the same, and they have very...
There are more difference between the Houthis and the Saudis than between the Houthis and the Iranians.
Yes, that's true. But to say that like the Houthis are engaged in some kind of sectarian battle of Shia versus Sunni is, I think, not a correct assessment of the situation. This is much more political in nature than it is kind of a age-old religious conflict. So we're not really talking about that. What is the interest
of Iran in supporting them?
Well, that's the big question, and it seems that Iran's support of the Houthis has actually grown in nature since, and so went back in, say, like 2012 or 2016, they were being portrayed as this Iranian offshoot when they weren't actually getting that much in terms of like weapon support from Iran. But that seems to have been almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now they're getting all sorts of support from Iran, and we actually have hard evidence. The British actually presented evidence at the UN. They captured a unmanned aircraft, like a drone, that they that was, I guess, supporting some kind of sea vessels that were taking weapons there, and they captured it, and the memory hadn't been wiped, and they actually got, basically photographs of this drone, like in Tehran with IRGC. So they have hard evidence that, yes, Iran is providing these weapons to the Houthis. They see them, they know where they're going. We have a lot of evidence, and it seems that that evidence has only grown. So it's very interesting that initially they really weren't supported by Iran. They seem to have done a pretty good job of kind of holding their own in Yemen, and now suddenly Iran is providing them lots of weapons, lots of technology, and actually like tactical support. I mean, it seems like there's good evidence that there are IRGC advisors in Yemen advising the Houthis on this. And so I think that begs the question of, I think in terms of Iran, it's like an easy way to stir up trouble. I don't want to make it sound like Iran is just stirring up trouble. There obviously are like tactical reasons for why they do what they do, but this seems to be a particular tactic or strategy that the IRGC, that's the Revolutionary Guards in Iran, that they have adopted, is this kind of like internationalization or supporting groups like Hezbollah, like Hamas. I mean, Hamas is not even remotely close to being a Shia group. I mean, they are vehemently Sunni here. So it's not like they have any kind of like religious affiliation here. But in terms of their political goals, we've got Iran providing them with a lot of support, money-wise, and in terms of all of that. So, and then the Houthis have become this other group that they've seen. I think the idea was like, hey, this is a pretty successful group. Let's make them more successful, and they'll kind of do what we want without having to do it ourselves, especially because there are kind of limitations on what they can do. Iran knows it stands no chance if the U.S. really wants to attack it. I mean,
But
that's
that is
like,
exactly what Iran is doing, for example, in Ukraine. What those who observe the situation in Central Europe, they know that Iran is supplying Russia with dozens of thousands of kamikaze attack drones, Shahed drones, and these drones are being used in Ukraine. There is
oh
no
yeah,
religious
there was
interest
a
to do
really
it.
good report on that recently. Not only are they supplying these drones, but they're like souping them up to include like jet fuel power and stuff like that. I mean, this is a serious. I think it should be highlighted. This is a serious issue. The Iranian drone technology is being sold to Russia and used in Ukraine and advanced even beyond what Iran had created it for. I mean, this is like this is. I think a lot of people don't realize this. They think it's just Russian technology in Ukraine. No, there's Iranian technology there too.
Absolutely. And but we are talking now also about the situation in Saudi Arabia, and that's why I wanted to go a bit deeper in what is going inside of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We know that the King Salman is not in his youngest age, he's 88. And what is the situation with the transit of power? Who will be the successor in the next time? And what qualities should this person have to successfully run such a complicated country?
So one of the interesting things that we're at right now in Saudi Arabia. So let's go kind of all the way back to understand how momentous the transfer of power will be when it happens. Let's go kind of all the way back to Saudi Arabia's beginning in the early, or we're talking about the beginning of like modern Saudi Arabia, the beginning. So King Abdulaziz ibn Saud essentially founded modern Saudi Arabia. He was king or ruler of the Nejd region of Saudi Arabia, which is where Riyadh is, and he was able to basically expand his control and conquer all the other parts of Saudi Arabia. The last one being the Hijaz region, which is which is the region of Saudi Arabia that is. That's on the Red Sea. And so once he was able to do that, he was able to consolidate his control over the kingdom, and he became the monarch. Now, the problem
And we
was
are talking about the time after the World War
1932.
II.
Yeah, at the time of World War One. We're talking about right after World War One. And so part of the issue then was he didn't really have any way to make money. Basically the only way he made money was taxes on people who were going to Hajj, and he would like collect money from the various tribes. Like they were supposed to all like pay him money. He was very poor, and there was an American company that wanted to look for oil in Saudi Arabia, and he really desperately needed money, and so he agreed to a concession. So basically the American company paid him money, and they got the right to look for oil in certain areas of his kingdom for a certain number of years, and then the concession also included how much they were going to pay him if they found oil and made money off of it. And he's like, I don't think that that you're going to find anything, but while you're out there looking for oil, could you try to also look for some water, because we could actually really use water. Lo and behold, they strike oil in commercial quantities. It starts being produced. He starts making a little more money. Things shut down during World War II, which became very difficult for him. He ended up getting some Lend-Lease aid from the United States, actually. But then after World War II, things picked up, made a lot of money. The issue then comes with succession. So when he died, his eldest son took over, and his eldest son was named Saud, so King Saud. Now, the way that the family, the monarchy, ran I would say they ran it a very kind of similar to like a business, and this had a lot of tribal roots. So the way that tribes in the Arabian Peninsula generally kind of made decisions about who was going to lead the tribe was there would be kind of like a council of the important elder people in the tribe, and they would select someone to be the ruler, and that person wasn't necessarily the oldest son. So it wasn't like a European monarchy where it would go from oldest son to oldest son to oldest son. That wasn't necessarily the way it would go. It depended on what this council would decide. And so Saud became king, but he was very bad at it. like terrible. And a lot of it, and Abdulaziz ibn Saud had many wives and many sons, many sons. In fact, I had a very difficult time putting together a family tree of all of his sons because there were so many, and that doesn't even include all the daughters he also had. So the royal family of Saudi Arabia is quite large. Some of the sons, many of them, also had positions in government. They became ministers and so on and whatnot. Not all of them did, but a lot of them did. And it became clear pretty quickly that Saud was running the place into the ground. And so eventually the brothers essentially called a meeting of each other, and they said, "You're out." They put in place his one of his younger brothers to rule, and so that's kind of when things began to be established as rule would be passed down from brother to brother as opposed to eldest son to eldest son, and so then they also established kind of an office of like an office of crown prince, so that they kind of knew who the next person to go would be. And so there was Saud, and then there was his next brother. When Faisal was actually assassinated by his nephew, who was a little crazy, and so when he was assassinated, he died. It went to another brother. Now, not every brother is in the line of succession. Some brothers either decided they didn't want to be, or they were kind of excluded. There was one brother. He actually recently died. I'm blanking on his name right now, but his son is a very successful businessman. But anyway, he was kind of excluded from the whole process because he spoke out very vociferously about having, more democratic principles, and he was actually exiled for a while because he was too much of a populist. He was a bit too close to the Arab nationalists in Egypt. So not everyone gets in the line of succession.
Excuse me for interrupting you, but this sounds extremely complicated, much more complicated than the British monarchy, which has almost zero political influence. And this family runs one of the richest nations of the world and one of the most important producers of oil. How much stability has this system?
Exactly. It's quite complicated, but at the same time, there's actually a lot of stability within it because, first of all, these guys tend to live a really long time. So they have very long reigns. Yes, okay, Queen Elizabeth also lived for a very long time. But they have long reigns, and it tends to be known ahead of time who the successor will be because they choose a crown prince. And they all meet and kind of, I don't know if they really vote on it, but they have these meetings where they decide these things. And so it had always been decided, like who was actually in the line of succession and who might. And in fact, there were a lot of princes who were in the line of succession who died before their elder brother died, so they ended up never being able to be considered. So we went from Saud to Faisal to King Fahd. So King Fahd actually suffered a stroke, and he lived for like another almost 10 years, but was totally incapacitated. And so Abdullah, who had been the next in line, basically was the de facto ruler. He was still the crown prince. He wasn't technically the king because Fahd was still alive. He was just incapacitated from a stroke. Then Fahd eventually died, and Abdullah became king. And then there were a lot of different crown princes at that point because a lot of them kept dying before Abdullah did. Finally, Abdullah died, and Salman became king. And Salman is one of the youngest brothers. And the problem is that
where we are now, where we have King Salman,
exactly,
who is the youngest brother, who is 88 years old.
Yes. So there aren't very many brothers left. There are a few, but some of them had been excluded from the line of succession either on their own terms or because their mother was a Yemenite woman, and so that's just not cool. A whole bunch of reasons, to the point where then there were two people. Well, there was one son who had been playing a big role in government, and he was kind of, everyone supposed he would be the first person in the next generation after Salman. Well, he was kind of maneuvered out of the line of succession by Salman's by one of Salman's sons. King Salman has a whole bunch of sons. He has several wives, and my theory at least is that Salman wanted his line to be the new line of succession. So as opposed to going to a son of another brother, he wants his sons. He wants to change the system from being one of brother to now his son and either another one of his sons or his son's son. And
this caused any tensions within the society?
Oh, huge tensions. When they tried to remove the other guy from Succession, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name. It was a huge it was like a night of the long knives. Or like remember in the Russian Revolution when they had to when they sealed the doors of Parliament and like Lenin took out everybody else except the Bolsheviks. It was kind of like that. They basically like locked him up in a room in a hotel and were like, we're not going to let you do anything until you just abdicate your position. And eventually he did. He wasn't so well, like he wasn't that healthy of a guy, and eventually he just gave in. And so now we have Mohammed bin Salman, who is not King Salman's oldest son. In fact, one of his older sons is currently the oil minister. So he's not in the line of succession. He is the oil minister. And so that's how we end up with Mohammed bin Salman, who is pretty young. And it seems that King Salman specifically wanted his son Mohammed to run the country. And there's a lot of talk about how Salman is incapacitated. He doesn't remember anything. He's not in charge. There may be some truth to those things that they say, but he definitely was an extremely crafty guy. I mean, he was the governor of Riyadh for a long time. He at least knew what he was doing when he maneuvered this into being. Now, he may not be that much in control now, although a lot of people, myself included, think that Saudi Arabia will never be able to enter into any kind of treaty or peace agreement with Israel until Salman passes away, because he is vehemently anti-Israel. I mean, vehemently. Like he espoused, 9/11 conspiracies, that it was all planned by the Mossad on television back when he was governor of Riyadh. So, this is, in my estimation, it would be extraordinarily difficult for the Saudis to have any kind of agreement with Israel like UAE has until Salman is really not in the picture. Like he would have to
probably be dead. But there have been some steps to normalize the relations to Israel, at least to have some trade agreements and to have some secret embassies of Israel, like representation offices without any signs or any Israeli flag. But still, it was possible somehow. Exactly,
and I think that's because Mohammed bin Salman wants that he sees that as in his interest and in Saudi Arabia's interest, but I think that he is, there's a resistance being put up from his father. And I think that at some level, he won't be able to go as far as he wants to until his father is out of the picture. That's my assessment of where they are. And so it's very complicated. I think that for a long time, Saudi Arabia had very kind of stagnant, very... I would call it maybe stagnant. Some people call it stagnant, but other people would call it very consistent, very stable policies, because their rulers lived a long time, but they also did a lot of things through consensus, or at least in consultation with other brothers in the family. So change was really, really hard. That can be a bad thing in some respects. A lot of people were chafing at the societal restrictions, and it was very hard to change things. But it could also be a good thing. For many, many years, the monarchy basically left Aramco alone, and Aramco made them tons and tons of money. And the stability of that was actually very good for Aramco in the way it was run, and it really enabled them to basically act like an American oil company. They ran themselves like an American oil company, but without the constant pressure of having to keep your stock price up or satisfy shareholders, because they only had to satisfy one person really other than themselves, and that was the king. And in fact, they used to call him the shareholder. He was referred to, as the shareholder. That was the king. And as long as he was satisfied, so they could really maintain a very long-term vision, as opposed to other oil companies that have to have a lot more in terms of short-term vision. Like they're planning for the next 10 years, Aramco can plan for 50 years or longer. So there are definitely some benefits, but on the other hand, there are some really problematic issues in which you have a society, that barely changed since the 40s. I mean, it wasn't until recently that women were even allowed to drive. So I think, you've got trade-offs there, but it was a very stable society. You had a very good idea of what they were going to do, how they were going to act. Things are changing right now. We don't always know how they're going to act. And a lot depends on one man, the crown prince.
Exactly, and this concept of consensus that you have mentioned, Dr. Wald, I wonder how successful how successful would you name the Saudi Arabian policy towards the terrorism, like combating terrorism? We know that they have started several programs, like re-educating terrorists with some sort of bringing them back to the society and combating the religious radicalism. How successful are these programs? Are they only public relation programs for the West, like we have our own way, or do they really work?
So that's a really good question, and I think that in some respects, in some cases they worked and in some they don't. I think that a lot depends on the kind of society they're being reintegrated into, and Saudi Arabia was a society with a very strong very strong government control. So they're not necessarily being reintegrated into a free society where they can just go and meet with anyone they want to and read up about how to make car bombs on the internet. These people are going back into a society where they're going to be surveilled probably for the rest of their lives, and that their families could be at risk. So, this is a society where they will read everything that you write on Twitter and they will arrest you if they don't like it. So, when you reintegrate people into that kind of a society, and also one that has very strong familial support systems, I think that you will, on the surface, say that you have a lot more success. But remember, this is an authoritarian society. There's no due process here. I mean, there's no, so yes, reintegration. Do I think that these are programs that could be successfully replicated in more open societies? No.
And at the same time, we know the capital punishment, corporal punishment, or even killing journalists on the territory of the own embassy, which also doesn't fit quite into a picture of a very successful state. But what transformation can have the Saudi Arabian society and the political system during the next years? You have already named the society is very conservative, or some would call it stable or not transformed. But they will need to have to go into some transformations, I believe, to be successful in the future.
Yeah, I think a lot of people recognize that they really did need to open their society in kind of social and cultural ways, also economic ways, and I think that has definitely happened in some areas. I think, say you go to Riyadh or you go to to certain other cities that are kind of becoming more cosmopolitan. You can go to they have movie theaters. You can go to the movies. Can you see any movie in Saudi Arabia? No. There are only certain movies that they're going to play in the theaters there, but they have movie theaters.
And the movies are also from the Hollywood or imported movies, not only the own production or from the Muslim countries.
Oh yeah, you can see Marvel movies there. That's very big. Now, of course, the government has the biggest share in the movie theater companies that have opened there. So the government is making money off of this. They've definitely. I think one of the biggest complaints in terms of Saudi society actually came from the youth. They had a burgeoning youth population, and they felt very constrained by the cultural social constraints. So they really got rid of the ability of the religious police to do anything to people. So it used to be they would get angry if your hair covering wasn't sufficient. That's basically gone. Also, foreigners are basically not bothered. So if you look white, you can probably walk around in Riyadh. You definitely don't have to wear an abaya anymore. I don't go wearing a mini skirt. Okay, that's not going to be considered okay. But like there's definitely more freedom. There used to be nowhere for like kids to hang out or 20 something year olds to hang out. Now there are more kind of, I would say, like nightlife esque things. Like it used to be that people had to go into each other's houses, but now there are more things to do. A lot of it is state sponsored, like these big music festivals they have.
But
They're
is it
state
something
sponsored.
that is being like generally tolerated, or only tolerated as long as you don't make troubles, and as long as you have as you produce political troubles, you can get arrested just because, not because you get political troubles, but because you visited like some dance evening.
Yeah. So these are things that are state sanctioned. Not only state sanctioned, but the state like arranges them, and they bring in like Instagram influencers to snap pictures and show how great it is. So everybody else from the outside thinks, "Wow, stuff's really great in Saudi Arabia. Look at this great stuff." Is there a place? We're not seeing like the coffee shop kind of like Egypt, for example, always had a robust civil society. Men would meet in coffee shops and they'd have independent newspapers and people talked about politics and they had this robust civil society. No, that's not what we're talking about in Saudi Arabia. The government is loosening certain restrictions and giving sanction to certain activities that would have been considered religiously immoral in order to make people happier so that they don't complain and they don't, form underground rebellions. So, yeah, there's a lot of stuff you can't do, but these kind of state sanctioned things are acceptable. And so I think the idea is to make life more palatable and for especially the young people to feel like they don't have to go abroad to have a good time, and to kind of keep them happy and, satiated in a sense. Is it real, like, independent, I don't want to make light, like, there's a lot of wonderful, amazing cultural stuff going on in Saudi Arabia. And, if people are interested in visiting, that there is a lot of incredible, like, art and culture and music and things like that. But you just have to be aware that a lot of these so-called, like, bars are it's all state sanctioned. It's all state sanctioned. You're not going to find, like, the indie, political indie music scene. It's not like Iran where there were lots of like underground political movements. People there are not really interested in doing that, and that's not what we're seeing. It's not like the state is suddenly loosening restrictions. It's that they're loosening it in ways that are state sanctioned.
So it is exactly like it was in the latest Soviet Union when it was allowed to produce Soviet jeans, but you could still be arrested if you try to illegally import original jeans from the United States.
Yes.
And this comparison to Iran, what you have made, it seems to be very interesting. So in Iran, we have the underground, more or less free, uncontrolled civil society. In Saudi Arabia, we have a state-organized, like semi-seen corporation.
Yeah.
But the both countries, they are in competition for their influence abroad. We know that Saudi Arabia massively builds mosques abroad, from Jordan, other countries. Iran supports the groups like Houthis, Hezbollah, even Hamas. What kind of ways is more successful? What is the future for Saudi Arabia influence in their neighbors?
So I think that Saudi Arabia really regretted paying for all those mosques because they all became hotbeds of Islamic fundamentalism and people who actually turned out to want to overthrow the monarchy. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that basically just like the Saudi family had kind of a deal with Aramco, they also had a deal with the religious, kind of like the religious establishment in Saudi Arabia. And they basically had this deal where they would support the religious establishment with money, and the religious establishment would basically like be okay with their monarchy, would like sanction the monarchy. And it worked out well, although they did have some disagreements, like they want to bring TV to Saudi Arabia, like back in the 50s, 60s, and they had to get permission from the religious authorities to say it's okay. The problem with that was the religious authorities ended up, that these groups, they basically used state money to pay for all these mosques that ended up being becoming hotbeds of Islamic fundamentalism. I think Saudi Arabia is, at least the monarchy, is taking a different tack now with its money and its influence, and they're doing it through through venture capitalism, more of a sense. So they have a lot of money. Now they're using that money to invest in businesses. So how do you get, so they invest, like the company, Lucid, for example, like they're investing a lot of money in this electric car company. And there are a lot of ways that the Saudis have to invest money in companies that make it not even seem like it's directly from, the Saudi Public Investment Fund. And so I think that that's really where they are trying to spread their influence more, is really through kind of in like the boardrooms of companies and in corporate ways. Is it as successful? Is it going to be successful? Well, I think that remains to be seen, because sometimes, depending on the country, there are regulations about, disclosing where your money is coming from, and people can get into trouble if people find out that they've got a lot of Saudi money. It can become a liability as opposed to a benefit. But I would definitely say that that's much more of where at least they seem to be putting their influence now. Iran is like a totally different thing, because they've always had a really strong civil society. Another difference is also in the educational system. Saudi high schools do not train students to be in critical thinking. Like they train, like students want to know, what do I need to know for the test? And that's very much a product of like this kind of obedience, like obedience to your family, obedience to the tribe, obedience to the king. Like the king wants you to support Aramco's IPO. We're going to support Aramco's IPO. There isn't a whole lot of like, does this make financial sense for me? Is this a good idea? How do we think about this in a critical way? They don't get that. And Iran is a very different sense. They've always had very strong, academic institutions and like these kind of, at least, and going on like history of, this kind of intellectual society. And so, it's a very different situation there. The revolution, in fact, part of the ideology of the Iranian Revolution came out of these, universities. So, so we're talking about two very, very different countries with very different cultures, but yet this desire to have influence. And Iran does it in many ways through proxy armies, essentially. And Saudi Arabia is, at least now, they had done it through funding these mosques, which turned out to, in the end, be a bad idea for them. I think now they're taking a much more kind of financial tact. I don't know if that's, that's going to be successful, but they always have this trump card to fall back on, which is they have the largest producible oil reserves in the world and the ability to produce them. Now, is Saudi Arabia the largest oil producer in the world? Not right now. That's the United States. Can they produce more oil than the United States? Probably. Do they have? They have the ability, probably. But they also have it all under centralized control, which the United States does not. So,
but you have already mentioned that they try to invest in different markets and different technologies, not obligatory alternative energy sources, but just different sources of income. And how successful they are, what share of the economy got invested into, so to say, untypical branches of the economy?
So I would say it's not all that successful yet. I think that they have this goal that they will, the government will be able to basically live off of their investments, kind of like an endowment, say, for like a university, and they won't depend on the oil industry. And I don't think that is possible. It's just not possible to make that much return off of investments as it is to make what they do from their oil industry. Now, the oil industry is dynamic, so it's not just the price of crude oil times the number of barrels they sell per day. They make a lot of money in other things as well. But this idea that they could become some kind of investment powerhouse, I think is misguided. And then they also have this idea that they're going to develop these other sectors of their economy, like tourism is going to be a huge sector of their economy. And, I think that's a huge error. I mean, if you look at tourism, take the state of Florida. which is where I live. Huge tourist area, right? People want to go to Disney World, they want to go to Miami, they want to go on cruises that leave from Florida. I mean, Florida has a really large, like a lot of beaches, big tourism area, golf, all of that, nice weather. Tourism is not even close to being the largest sector of Florida's GDP. That's agriculture. So the idea that Saudi Arabia wants to grow their tourism sector to this like $1 billion, it's not going to happen. Not that many people want to go to a country where it is totally inhospitable for many, many months of the year. Like, you don't want to be there in the summer. And you can't drink alcohol, and you can't worship unless you're Muslim. I mean, it's kind of, yes, there may be a niche industry there. There may be people who are really into visiting like super old Islamic sites or pre-Islamic historical sites. They have some really interesting sounding ecotourism going on in the Red Sea. Of course, no one's going to want to go there if the Houthis are, commandeering ships. So there's also that aspect. But they're never going to be like a place that everyone wants to go to. So to me, it seems a little bit misguided to think that that even with huge amounts of investment in your tourism sector, that you're going to actually achieve the kind of returns that you're looking for. At least that would be my assessment, is that yes, they can grow it, yes, they can make it better and nicer, but it's never going to be like a place that people are going to flock to.
So a lot of challenges which the Saudi Arabia is facing right now, the economic transformation, the attempt to create new sectors of the economy, the succession of power to Crown Prince bin Salman, if this happens one day, and of course now the situation in the Red Sea with the Houthi rebels attacking the cargo vessels which pass by the shore of Saudi Arabia. A lot of questions, a lot of challenges. Not every challenge is clear how to find an answer. But we have had this conversation with Dr. R.Wald, who is president of Transversal Consulting, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center, and a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. She's also an author of a book, Saudi Incorporated, and an expert in the internal affairs of Saudi Arabia. Thank you, Dr. Wald, for your interview.
Thank you for having me.
And don't forget to like this channel, to share this video, to subscribe to this channel. And if you have your ideas or comments, then leave them under this video, and see you in the next interviews.